what, Scott? Your dream's about to come true. Are you ready for your day to get a whole lot better?
Yes.
Go for it, man.
In the early 2000s, car reality TV shows became popular and were a sure way for networks to keep people watching them. One of such automotive reality TV shows was called Overhaulin, and it was certainly one of the most watched shows of its time. Despite having extremely high ratings and having thousands or even millions of fans at the beginning of the show, it was remarkably short-lived and had only about 5 seasons. Interestingly, the fact that the first version of Overhaulin ended after 5 years despite massive fan love isn't the most interesting thing about the show. The most interesting thing, by far, is the fact that the show was cancelled and rebooted thrice in 16 years. When Overhaulin came to an end for the first time, people had loads of questions. Why did it come to an end so quickly? Was the show hiding any dark secrets? Did the show have any unhappy car owners? Was there any behind-the-scenes politics that handicapped the show? Remarkably, these questions persisted through the second and third cancellations of the show, and they have stayed unanswered by TLC, the network that first aired it. But we'll not let this sleeping dog lie. After hours and hours of painstaking research, we finally have jaw-breaking information to tell you about Overhaulin, the truth behind the show's cars, and the real reason the show ended just after 5 seasons. The first thing that stood out about Overhaulin when it first got to television was that it wasn't the basic automobile TV show. It was different in every way and gave people something different. It was somewhat like a prank show, sliced with a social experiment show, then sliced with a drama, sliced with an automobile show. It was the perfect mix of everything that made reality TV entertaining.
Signed off. The waiver has been signed. So I would just need your signature, and we have given us a check for the 500 already, so. Okay? We actually...
No, I don't want to hear anything. Just let me sign it and get the out of here.
Every episode of the show started with the showrunners choosing a mark. This mark was usually the owner of an antique or classic vehicle in need of overhauling. Once the mark was chosen, the presenters of the show, alongside relatives or friends of the mark, would tell the mark that something awful had happened to their car. They could say that the vehicle had been towed, lost, wrecked, or even stolen in some cases. They kept this ruse up for 8 days, and in those 8 days, the mechanics on the show had to completely overhaul the vehicle and turn it into something so awesome that the mark would be completely blown away. This format may sound ordinary right now, but it made for simply amazing television thanks to the man who managed to put it all together, Chip Foose. If Chip had treated his job as a presenter on Overhaulin as an ordinary one, he probably wouldn't have become as successful as he is now. But because designing cars and overhauling them wasn't just a job to him, but a passion, he managed to make Overhaulin a success. Chip first learned of cars when he was still pretty young, but ever since then, he's hardly looked back. Once he got grown enough to start working and earning some money, he started working with Boyd Coddington, one of the biggest designers of hot rods in the country. Chip got a lot of opportunities to leave Boyd for better jobs, but he just couldn't because the work he did for Boyd intrigued him. It was during his years with Boyd Coddington that he decided that he would design vehicles for a living and become pretty great at it. After a while, Chip decided that he was smart and savvy enough to leave Boyd Coddington and set out on his own. And boy, was he right. In 1984, he finally set up his shop and called it Foose Designs. Within a short while, he built a fantastic reputation for building some of the most extraordinary cars in the San Francisco area. He got so renowned that at the age of 31, he was the youngest member to be inducted into the Hot Rod Hall of Fame at the 50th anniversary of Peterson Publishing. Before long, people in the media started recognizing his genius, and he was featured in an automotive documentary aired on the TLC network. The main focus of that documentary was one of Chip's creations, which was a 2002 Ford Thunderbird. That documentary was what sealed Chip's television fate. Once the executives over at TLC saw the documentary, they saw the star potential in Chip, and work immediately began on a reality TV show that would see Chip refurbish cars in the most extravagant way possible. Of course, Chips could never have done the very difficult job of hosting Overhaulin on his own. That's why he had help from a host of other interesting presenters such as Jesse Combs, Hanson, and Ariane Celeste. He also could have never done the very difficult job of refurbishing and remodeling these classic cars alone. That's why he had a team called the A-Team. This team included experts like Andreas, Ian, Mark, and Richard, along with Scratch and Andy. This was the crew that worked in the vehicle for the 8 days when it was hidden from the mark. Now that we think of it, the fact that the show mandated Chips and his crew to perform redecoration magic on any vehicle in just 8 days was probably one of the reasons why the show came to an end. Overhaulin, like every other automotive reality show of its time, had scripted drama. That means it wasn't a real reality TV show, it was just a show filmed like one. But the fact that the show was scripted doesn't mean that there weren't unscripted parts of it. For example, the 8-day deadline that Chip and his crew had to refurbish the classic cars was absolutely real. That means every single car in the show that was worked on by Chip and his crew was done in about 8 days or less. Since Chip wasn't a slave driver, he was there with his team every day working on the vehicles. This hectic schedule made a lot of the show's important characters sleep deprived, and very soon they simply didn't want to get the job done anymore. And it didn't take long for that to reflect on the screen, but that wasn't the only reason why the show's quality started to drop. Another important reason was the quality of the cars that the show was restoring. At the beginning of the show, it was easy to try to engross viewers with basic classic cars that weren't cheap but weren't exactly expensive either. But as the show went on, it became harder to keep the viewers engrossed with those basic cars. A simple solution to the problem, of course, would be for the show to work on more difficult cars. Unfortunately, that wasn't an option since the show itself had a limited budget, and the team working on the cars had a limited period to work on the cars. Like with all automotive shows, the cost of fixing up the cars in Overhaulin was carried by the show alone. That's why the show often got thousands of requests from the relatives of thousands of potential marks. The people who requested to have their cars on the show knew that getting accepted would mean a free upgrade of their cars. Unfortunately, there was a crazy twist to this. A lot of the owners of the vehicle immediately sold it after getting an upgrade. The awful part of this was that the show could not stop people from doing this. Even the car owners who didn't want to sell their upgraded vehicles often eventually had to, as the value of the vehicle increased drastically after the upgrade, and this increased the payable tax of the people who own the vehicles. And in many cases, they got into a situation where they had to sell the vehicle to pay their taxes. Both the limit on the repair time and the budget needed for the show essentially limited the kind of cars that the show could work on, and as such doomed Overhaulin to work on the same kinds of cars and have the same kinds of outcomes. That, of course, would look repetitive and boring to viewers and would affect ratings, and that's precisely what it did. When Overhaulin got into its 5th season, its ratings were already dropping, and it was getting pretty difficult for the show to justify its continued existence. And since show business is a business, once Overhaulin stopped justifying its existence through high ratings, it had to be cancelled. After a while, the show was rebooted again, but the same issues that had plagued the show's first run continued to plague it. The time constraints still limited how crazy Chip could go with the vehicles, and budget constraints meant that the show had to choose the vehicles it updated very carefully. Overhaulin was a show that came with a lot of promise. The premise of the show was great. Chip was an amazing presenter, and he had a great team with him. Sadly, as the show matured, the showrunners found it difficult to execute the great ideas behind the show. This led to low ratings and made the continued existence of the show unjustifiable. That's why the show eventually got cancelled.